Our scripture this morning comes from Mark chapter 13, verses 1 through 8. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be, and what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. If you would, please pray with me. Gracious and loving God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our rock and our Redeemer. In order to tackle today's passage, let's go back and take a look at a previous passage in Mark chapter 11 where Jesus curses a fig tree. In case you don't know this story, Jesus traveled into Jerusalem with his disciples, went into the temple, looked around, left, and headed to Bethany. The next day, on their way from Bethany to Jerusalem, Jesus saw a fig tree off in the distance that was completely leafed out. We are told in the text that it was not the season for figs, which makes Jesus' expectation regarding figs for food suspect. There must be another reason for Jesus' reaction to the fig tree. For those of you who work with fruit trees or any other kind of budding tree, we understand that the fruit develops usually on the new growth of the tree. The fig tree is unusual in that for a period of 3 to 5 years while the tree is maturing, there is no fruit production. Once the tree has developed to a certain point, then the fig tree will produce fruit 2 times per year. The first production of fruit is on old growth and is usually not edible due to the acidity of the fruit. The second production of fruit is on new growth and is usually sweet and enjoyable to eat. In the case of the fig tree cursed by Jesus, we have a textual conundrum to solve. In seeing the fig tree completely leafed out, the assumption would be that it would be loaded down with fruit. There are any number of reasons why this particular tree was not bearing fruit. It could be too young, for example. Nevertheless, Jesus uses the fig tree to illustrate an even bigger issue. Looks can be deceiving, which brings us to today's passage. Jesus and his disciples are leaving the temple, and one of the disciples makes a comment about the size of the temple. We know from the writings of Josephus, a Jewish historian working for the Roman Empire, that indeed the temple was a building to behold. The observation by the disciple illustrated the misplaced focus, the grandeur of the building rather than the godliness of the people. Jesus' response to the unnamed disciple is that the temple will be destroyed. Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down. The disciples with Jesus were utterly confused by his assertion, so much so that the disciples asked Jesus to explain. What follows from verse 3 through 37 is one of the longest recorded discourses spoken by Jesus in Mark. Much of this discourse is interpreted as a litany of events that will occur prior to Jesus' return to earth. There are really two things that are happening in this passage, both related to the cursing of the fig tree. While most Jewish scribes did not believe in an afterlife, they did not believe that God controlled history, Jews and Jesus' followers alike believed that the world had become so evil that only God could save it, and that God planned on rescuing the world from evil at the time of his choosing, which meant in the minds of most Jews, reestablishing an earthly kingdom where they were self-governed without interference from any empire, especially the Roman Empire. Jesus' prediction that the temple would be destroyed was contrary to popular belief among most Jews who were expectant of a ruler in the line of David who would liberate them from foreign occupation and rule. The temple was the one symbol the Jewish people had to depend on in their lives. In many ways, it was their blessing and their curse. The temple was their blessing in that they believed it was the literal house of God here on earth. It was on this very spot that the Ark of the Covenant was placed in the Holy of Holies as God's permanent residence among the people. It was their curse because the temple as a sanctuary for the people had become corrupt. The temple stopped bearing fruit. The cursing of the fig tree and the prediction regarding the destruction of the temple both served to call attention to a people once favored by God who had completely lost their way and were no longer bearing fruit. The nation of Israel as a political entity had become a worthless mechanism in the sacred scheme of things. Jesus illustrates through the cursing of the fig tree that the entire nation is worthy of destruction. Jesus is also letting the disciples know that within a short time period, approximately 40 years, the temple would physically fall. The Jewish people, unhappy with their arrangement with the Roman Empire, instigated all kinds of skirmishes trying to oust Rome from their borders, which only served to anger Rome. The temple did, in fact, fall in 70 AD. Once the temple was destroyed, the Jewish people had to reinvent themselves. They could no longer engage in the sacrificial system for the atonement of sins, which meant that their whole religious underpinning had just been altered. These two passages, that of the fig tree and that of the destruction of the temple, stand as interesting historical backdrops for a deeper discussion about what it means to be the church. The symbolism of destruction, both of the fig tree and the temple, where nothing was growing, stands as a barometer for us today. In a number of articles over the last 10 years, church leaders have warned that there is a decline in church membership across the board, and that the landscape of church is dying. Still, seminaries are training new leaders in the hopes that these predictions are incorrect. One does not have to be a rocket scientist, however, to see that many churches are in decline and some have already closed their doors. The bigger question for me is, why are these churches failing? Let me state for the record that there isn't a simple answer to this question, and we will in no way solve the problem of church growth in one sermon. But I do think that today's passage provides us with at least one tiny piece of this much larger puzzle. For years, I have wondered how much of the earth operates on the principle of life, death, and rebirth. The idea that something has to die in order for something else to grow has always fascinated me. It changes the way I view the world, especially the world of destruction. I don't know that I will ever be able to reconcile the destruction we see from a natural disaster with the vibrancy we see when people are determined to rebuild their lives. The loss definitely appears to outweigh the gain. And yet nature shows us that in other circumstances, if the acorn casing is not corrupted, the oak tree cannot form. Often the life cycles of most things in nature pass by us without ever being noticed. Rarely do I watch the actual progression from life to death to rebirth and acknowledge that I'm a witness to the miracle of resurrection. Still, that process is happening all around us. This is the same kind of process that our churches are undergoing. We could ask the rhetorical what-if question about the temple. If the temple were producing good fruit, would it have been destroyed? Of course, we don't know. But the unknowable answer for the temple is a great prompt for us asking the same question about our own churches in the 21st century. How do we even evaluate whether a church is producing fruit? Membership is usually the measure of growth, but that seems rather one-dimensional. If the temple were only measured in the number of individuals that darken the door, then most likely it never would have been destroyed. I think many of the answers come from our text last week. Jesus takes the scribes to task for being puffed up and arrogant, for stealing widows' houses, for being flashy or showy. If the pastor is full of self-importance, what image does that project to the congregation? And what behaviors does self-importance endorse? Self-importance is perhaps the starkest contrast between Jewish religious leaders and the disciples who were following Christ. The scribes viewed their position as elevated from the people and therefore superior. The disciples were the people, ordinary fishermen, tax collectors, and the like. What was originally a service position had turned into a payday, a way to get rich off the backs of the people. The temple system no longer reflected the will of God, but the will of the scribes. Self-importance destroyed the temple's capacity for spiritual growth. When we allow our ego to expand to that point, we are effectively easing God out of the picture. Notice that I am talking about the temple as an entity, not the individuals who attended temple. We have no way of knowing what kind of spiritual growth was present in the individuals who attended temple. What we do know, though, is that the leaders of an organization usually set the tone for that organization. Churches grow when there is a commitment from all those in leadership positions to continue in humble service to God. I recently read an article that listed 5 basic principles that are essential for church growth. Number 1, outreach is the priority. The longer churches exist, the more concerned members become with self-preservation and the less concerned with the church's original reason for being. Number 2, social interactions are the vehicle. Non-Christians come to Christ and the church primarily through relationships with Christians. Number 3, felt needs are the connecting point. Those who don't attend church don't recognize how relevant the gospel message is to meeting their personal needs. Number 4, relationships are the glue. If people have friends in the church, they will stay. And number 5, transitions provide the window of opportunity. Significant changes in people's lifestyles move them toward spiritual receptivity. We don't know whether the temple met any of these criteria, although various texts throughout the gospel would intimate that they did not meet most, if not all, of the criteria. Jesus taught in the temple, so it was a place that he desired to be some of the time, but there was no spiritual growth happening. Lest we only point our fingers at the temple that was destroyed, the real exercise is to examine our own church. How are we doing? Do we see signs of spiritual growth? I know that I am biased, so my answer may not count, but I would say yes. I do see spiritual growth in this church. Outreach is a priority. We are continually looking at ways to be the church in the 21st century. I also hear many conversations about reaching out to those who don't go to church or who don't know what it means to be a part of a church family. I've experienced firsthand our desire to meet each other at the point of our need, to listen and care for one another. I also see relationships being formed and nurtured with the potential for even more to develop as time goes on. And I know that we are all concerned about the transitions in others' lives. We have made that a priority by honoring and celebrating achievements, lamenting our loss, and sharing in the joys and sorrows of all the good and the bad in our lives. We are an open and affirming congregation of all people. We celebrate the diversity among us and challenge ourselves to be inclusive, even when it feels uncomfortable. As part of the United Church of Christ, we are redefining what it means to be the church. We are expanding our definition of who belongs in church, and we are seeking out all those for whom church once felt out of reach. We have the tenacity to believe that God is still speaking and that we are called to be the hands and feet of Christ. I believe that we can be a bright beacon of hope in a struggling city. As we move through our own set of transitions, we know the birth pangs of becoming the beloved community we desire. Unlike the temple in Jerusalem, there is something growing here. We are holding strong to the power and the message of Jesus as we play our part in bringing about God's kingdom here on earth. My prayer is, as always, may it be so. Amen.